Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we get an update on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, including, of course, what's happening from a military standpoint, as well as the geopolitical ramifications and the reasons that finally could lead us to an end to this conflict. We'll also talk about why Japan's Prime Minister is on a tour of G7 nations and is inking military pacts. For the first segment of the show, we're talking about Ukraine, which has become a de facto member of the NATO alliance. This is according to Ukrainian Defense Minister, and he told this to the BBC in a recent interview, citing the change in thinking of Western nations as evidence in support of his assessment. Once reluctant to provide military support directly, the US and its European allies have been providing billions of dollars worth of military and other aid to Ukraine since fighting began in Feb last year. This includes increasingly sophisticated and potent weapon systems. Alexei Reznikov said he was sure Ukraine would now also receive long sought-after weapons, including tanks, main battle tanks, I'm assuming, as well as advanced fighter jets, as both countries, Ukraine and Russia, seem to be preparing for new offenses as the weather changes. In his opinion, the escalation is just a matter of protocol. On the Russian side, of course, the belief remains that the fight has always been against NATO, since the West has supplied Ukraine with weapons in what they call a war of aggression. Ukraine, let's remind ourselves, has sought membership of NATO for several years, and the military alliance's moves to expand eastward are a key factor in the build-up to the current conflict. Prabir Purkayastha joins us for more. Prabir, good to have you back in the Daily Debrief studios. Firstly, tell us how you're viewing the latest military developments in the Ukraine conflict, and are they likely to have a significant impact beyond the theatre where these operations are taking place?
Well, if you see the theatre of operations, really the Donbass area, particularly the ones which faces Donetsk city, and the fact that Ukrainians have been using that to bombard Donetsk city for a long time. So the move seems to be, again, this has been building up for quite some time, is to take this from the rear and therefore cut them off from the rear, and therefore the lines of defense that has to be built. The first, one line of defense is really what Soledar, the salt mines, which is really apparently kilometers of tunnels over there. So therefore continuing the fight is not that difficult. And then the Artyomovsk, Bakhmut as a city, which is the other anchoring point of the line. So if this line gets broken, what will happen? We don't know. Presumably this line at least has been breached in Soledar because the Wagner group seems to have captured the city center. But it doesn't mean the fight is over. If you remember Mariupol, there was steelworks in which there were deep underground chambers in which the fight continued for quite some time. So here also in the salt mines, whether there would be such similar resistance, we don't know. And it's very difficult to predict in a military scenarios because both sides would give pictures which are their version of it. So we don't really know what the real actual events in the ground are, if anybody knows about it. That's even a question during a war. But it does seem that Soledar has largely fallen. There might be pockets of resistance, but it's probably a period of time before that is warmed up. So there is a breach on that line that we were talking about. Will it affect Bakhmut? Will it make it easier for the Russian forces to capture Bakhmut? Let's not forget the Donbass group, military, armed people, they are there from Donbass region who are also fighting here. So it's not really just the Russian army. So that is one question, what happens over here. But is it going to change the larger military picture? That is an open question.
Right. Because NATO, like you were pointing out when we were talking earlier, has the resources to continue this fight for as long as Ukraine has the stomach also to continue it. And so how, I mean, none of this seems to have any kind of concluding impact on the conflict itself, neither for the parties involved nor for the wider region. So how will the broader geopolitics of it operate, and what are the mechanisms that are perhaps being looked at in the coming months?
You see, if you take Russia's shorter-term interest, it would be to see that the defenses which face from the Ukrainian side, the Donbass region, that is overthrown in the sense that it's taken, captured, and therefore the risk to Donbass and Donetsk city particularly is neutralized. So that would be their limited objective. Once they have that, then they have more or less liberated the Donbass region, which is what their initial intent was. They have a strong position in Kherson to protect Zaporizhia, to protect the headwaters of Crimea. So that's another strategic goal that they have. So given that, whether they will stop here, they will do something else. Open question. Again, from Russian side, their other objective was to destroy the Ukraine military and see that it doesn't join the NATO. Now, the first is a military objective. The second is a political one.
Yeah.
Now, the second political one, as long as the NATO powers continue to support Ukraine, that, of course, is not going to happen.
Yeah.
And already, you can see NATO forces literally are pouring into Ukraine in terms of arms, armaments, tanks, missiles,
all kinds of material.
the whole works. Argument is the people are not coming. But you know, you can't operate this kind of complex machinery and arms
just like
without experienced people. So the assumption is there are experienced people who might have left the army, who are being hired to do it, or there are people from the NATO forces who have been sort of what is it
Deputed,
called? Deputed,
seconded
to these fronts,
posted,
but not posted maybe at the front but posted at the slightly second line of defense, so where they can direct, train continue to support these. So this is the second layer where the problem right now is, because while Ukraine's original military supplies, what they had and what they got, seems to be running out, that really sending in these kind of things, light tanks, Bradleys are neither armored vehicles nor tanks, somewhere in between. So light armored, whatever we call them, machine guns and other stuff.
Fighting vehicles.
Yes. So all of these are really coming in at the moment.
There are also talks of German Leopard tanks coming in through Poland.
German Leopard tanks, yes, that is one. So there are lots of these talks going on. But how they come in and what is the support they get, because training Ukrainian forces to use these will take a lot of time. And what Ukraine doesn't have immediately is time. So that is one question mark. But you know, at the end of it, as long as Ukraine is willing to fight and its people are willing to fight to stop the Russians or take back territory, as they're saying, this fight will continue because Russia has a clear objective which it has set out, and it is to stop the eastward march of NATO. So that is not going to end just like that. Just capturing the Donbass region is not probably going to end it. So does the fight get into a deep freeze or is there some kind of a reapproachment? Are both not immediately on the anvil? This is not immediately on the table for both sides. So question, therefore, is not just Ukrainian stomach for the fight, but the NATO's stomach for the continuing impact of this war, both on their stock of arms and ammunition, the cost they're paying, and the Americans have paid a pretty large bill for this. But their argument is, yeah, we are doing it to politically destroy Russia, economically destroy Russia. That's what the bill. And ultimately, that's therefore not such a big bill for this purpose. So if that is the way it is politically seen, well, we have to see where it starts to hurt the people. It is already starting to hurt the people in European Union. So there is where the whether the buck will stop there, it's really the buck about the money. And unfortunately for Europeans, particularly for the German industry, with the high prices we are seeing of energy, a lot of the German industry, as we have been discussing, has been affected. It will have cascade effect on the people. The price of energy, electricity is only one parameter. The point is, if the German industry, large parts of it shut down, then what happens? And this is something which Italy, France, other countries will also have to face in the future. So I think that's a big question mark. But if it breaks, if NATO breaks, it has to break first in Europe, not in the United States. And I think that is the key question. What happens in Ukraine militarily? what happens politically and economically in Western Europe.
In Western Europe. Thanks very much for clarifying that, Prabir. And we'll move on to talk about the Japanese Prime Minister who's on a tour of the G7 nations in the middle of a phase that is being looked at as Japan's largest militarization process since the end of the Second World War. Anish, we were just talking to Prabir Purkayastha about the scenario at present in Ukraine and how NATO is continuing to obviously militarily as well as economically continue to fuel its part in that conflict. In the meantime, the Japanese Prime Minister is visiting the G7 nations in the middle of a phase of militarization that has been Japan's most aggressive since the end of World War II. What are the updates on his itinerary on this whistle-stop tour and what's on the agenda really?
Well, the agenda is pretty much to service the heavy militarization, as you pointed out, heavy militarization that Japan is now on the path towards. It's kind of, we should remind the audience that Japan is right now in the process of basically doubling its military budget to nearly, more than a third of the national budget towards military spending over the next 5 years. And that is definitely, the fact that they are trying to make military deals, very specifically military deals, with the countries that they're visiting, that Kishida is visiting right now, shows that it is pretty much geared towards that. So far, this is essentially seen as a G7 run because obviously Japan is now heading the G7, the group of 7 nations, and will be hosting the upcoming meeting. So obviously they're trying to couch it as the Prime Minister trying to have a G7 run before any meetings come up, any major summits come up. But in the process, what we are seeing is the kind of deals that have come up. So one is the deal that they signed with the United Kingdom just a couple of days ago, which is basically about giving reciprocal access, reciprocal military access, to be very precise, to each other, which means that it is going to allow British military access to Japanese territorial waters and Japanese territories as well. So, which means that both the countries can, the idea is that both the countries can have military drills on each other's lands. But in this case, Britain has actually made commitments to protect Japan and other allies in the region in the past as well. So obviously, and they have also made a commitment to actually deploy warships to Asian waters, and so that specifically to the East Asian region. So this basically shows the kind of turn that they are trying to take, where they're trying to pretty much consolidate the pro-NATO, the pro-US forces, and mobilize them towards East Asia now. And Japan is obviously going to be the pivot of that. Another deal that they made is to produce fighter jets with in collaboration with Italy and the United Kingdom. So obviously that is also happening. On the other hand, you have a 2+2 meeting, held earlier this week on Wednesday between the foreign minister and defense ministers of the two countries of Japan and United States. Recently, and we have talked about the littoral forces, where US is now planning to spread out its forces across the Japanese territories, and basically complete the whole encirclement policy against China. And these factors obviously, and that is also serviced by the fact that now the US is the meeting that they held recently with the US president actually said that they are going to boost strategic relationships or military relationships, which is basically a code word for military relationships. And all of these factors obviously shows that there is a very clear pivot towards militarization in the region now.
Anish, you mentioned China, of course, as the target of this entire pivot and the entire encirclement process as well. What is the likely impact? And also, it's not the end of the tour, there's still more expected.
Yeah, they have now Germany, another Axis force that Japan used to, an Axis ally that they used to be during the Second World War. Very ironically, Germany is now the last in the list of visits in the G7, at least, countries. So we are going to see whether, we have to wait and see what kind of deals that they're going to come up with, because obviously Germany doesn't have the sort of global presence of military like UK and United States have,
Mm,
courtesy to the fact that they actually control colonial, uh, you know, colonial territories across the world in different parts of the continent, in different continents as well. So obviously that allows them to have their military presence pretty much around the globe. Germany doesn't have that.
mm,
So, but we have to see how, if whether or not they're going to make any kind of deals with it, which would be again a problematic thing, because we have seen how the last time, the past experiences of that sort of military deals between the two countries have actually turned out to be. But in the region, this clearly shows that Japan is now very serious about this militarization program under Kishida. And also obviously this is coming at a time when Kishida's popularity is pretty much at record levels, record lows in Japanese history for any prime minister, and primarily because of his, mismanagement of the economy, the ballooning inflation and ballooning unemployment in the country. And obviously, we have seen recent controversies with the Unification Church. So that is also
mm.
there. You have, so you need to really wait and see how the Japanese people are going to uh,
React.
react to that, because on one side there is obviously a majority support. We see opinion polls showing that Japanese people are, by and large, support expanded militarization. They also support spreading out forces, US forces in Okinawa, in different parts of the country. But on the other side, you see them not wanting to pay for the heavy militarization budget that the
Mm.
government has passed recently, and neither do they want the US military next door. So it is going to be a very dicey thing for the Japanese government to balance these factors
Balance.
out. There is also the fact that Japan is right now trying to reinforce, and we have talked about this, reinforce its claims on disputed territories. So that can also create friction with South Korea, despite the fact that there are ideologically similar governments in place in both sides of the in both countries. So we need to wait and see how that is going to happen. But obviously, the pivot is against China here, and Japan is trying to be that this epicenter of this anti-China pivot in the region, and that can only be problematic as Japan also goes towards this path of shedding its own constitutionally pacifist stand, and
Mm.
which they plan to do by the end of 2027.
Right, we have a little bit more time, Anisha, a couple more minutes on the show. So maybe we can, you mentioned the Kishida's mismanagement of the economy, and at a time when the US is waging its chip war against China, all that also factors into what's happening in these discussions?
Yes, definitely, because Japan, apart from Taiwan and South Korea, are pretty much the region countries that they're looking for, as the US is looking for, to what they call as diversifying, production sources and supply chain sources. So that basically means they want to divert production units of their companies, their tech companies specifically, to these regions. Now that can be kind of dicey, because obviously, especially when we talk about chip production, as you mentioned, because Taiwan pretty much dominates the global market on chip production, And any kind of competition in that regard can only mean that they will be, at the receiving end of it. So even if it's, what they look, ideologically similar governments that are doing it in South Korea or Japan, it is definitely going to have an impact on their own economy overnight. But nevertheless, we have seen the TSMC, one of the biggest chip manufacturers in the world, opening new production units in Japan and the United States. And that happened because of US prompting. We have reports suggesting that the US prompted towards this sort of, supply chain diversification, as they call. And that definitely brings out, production units outside of Taiwan, despite the fact that it is a Taiwanese state-owned company that is doing it. So that is this is just one example of the kind of conflicts that can happen with the US trying to, move out supply chain lines out of China. But the problem is that neither of these countries have the sort of manpower or the large, massive labor market that China offers to this day, the skilled labor market that is irreplaceable at this point in global economy, and that cannot be taken over by Japan or South Korea or Taiwan under any imaginable circumstances. So this is something that can be challenging. We do not know what the US is like. The plan is not really set, but obviously Japan and other countries in the US aligned countries in the region are trying to take out all the goodies from, or whatever they can take out from or profit out of from this situation and this animosity towards China.
Good one. Thanks, Anish. So no surprises overall, but lot to definitely keep an eye on. Thanks again. That concludes this episode of the Daily Debrief. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Also, don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice if you haven't done so already. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.
For more videos on people's struggles, please subscribe to our YouTube channel.